everybody, and welcome to We Need to Talk. We are delighted to have you here tonight. We hope you're there in your cozy pajamas with your mug of tea and ready to just sit with us and do some thinking about women and nonviolence. We're really delighted to have this time together. Tonight is going to be Valerie Smith and I, and our third collaborator on this, Wendy Kroeker, is going to say a few words in a minute about upcoming events. And of course, we're grateful to Neustaeter for doing the tech for this. Now, you may have been with us when we had our first run of this in the spring, and it was David Balzer and I who were the co-hosts. Unfortunately, we weren't able to keep that going for a variety of health reasons for both David and I. And David has sent us a message saying he's with us in spirit, and we're glad he's doing well. And we miss him on this, but we're also delighted to be carrying it forward with Valerie and with Wendy. So welcome tonight. You're welcome all, and welcome also to our guests. Before we get there, though, I just want to talk a little bit about, give the ball over to Wendy to talk a little bit about our upcoming episode, because we're really excited about the next one we're going to do as well. So welcome back, Wendy. Welcome back to Winnipeg.
Thank you. It's good to be back in Winnipeg. Thanks, Karen and Val, for hosting this evening. This is an exciting restart. So I just want to put a plug in for our next one, which is November 16th, also a Wednesday evening at 9:30. And Jerry McChalsky is one of the guests that will join us. Jerry has just returned from a trip to Ukraine, and my conversation with him this afternoon was heartbreaking, a sliver of hope, and a whole bunch of messiness as he related questions that people in churches that he visited said to him, what would you do in our situation? And feeling that they are struggling with options. And so he will be with us to share the struggles of people there. He wants to be pushed on whether we think there are any nonviolent options there. He's finding people very discouraged on that end. So I think given the topic that We Need to Talk started with in April, is now the war is in a very different place. And I think the questions are even more complicated. So please do join us, invite people to join us in a conversation that I think, given my conversations with Jerry, will stir your heart, break your heart, force your heart, and invite us into a very important conversation. So thank you for the opportunity to say something about that one. And we look forward to a series of conversations, me just highlighting the second one. So back to you, Karen and Val, for the conversation this evening, and looking forward to the guests that you have.
Excellent. Thank you, Wendy. Just remind us again of the date of that.
Wednesday evening, November 16.
Excellent. Thanks, Wendy. And yes, looking forward to that as well. Valerie, why don't you say a few words about the format before I introduce the topic of tonight and our guests?
Yeah, thanks, Karen. Thanks, Wendy, for that. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I'm delighted to have all of you here with me and the rest of us here this evening. So I'll just say a little bit about our plans for this hour. When Karen and David were starting this in April, they called it We Need to Talk. And that doesn't mean sort of a lecture, but more of a conversation. We really want this to be a place of dialogue and conversation about nonviolent action, about some of the other difficult topics we're facing. And so we have a format that we hope will be interactive and give us a chance to all be in conversation. So we've got a couple of amazing guests tonight, and Karen will introduce them in just a minute. We will start with some of the questions we have for them and give them a chance to answer those. And then we're going to make some space for the rest of you to jump in with your questions, your comments, your thoughts. We know people might be joining us with a variety of perspectives on this topic. Maybe you're brand new to this, curious, skeptical, want to get a little more information. Maybe you're coming with tons of experience and passion and looking to connect with others. Wherever you fall in relation to this topic, we are welcome to this conversation, and we're really glad to have you join us. When we get to the part that will invite your thoughts and conversations, there's two ways that you can do that in this modern version of a call-in show. You're welcome to use the chat function in Zoom and type in your question or your thoughts there, and we'll read those, share them with the rest of the group. The other option is to raise your virtual hand. The reactions button at the bottom of Zoom gives you a raise hand option. And so if you click on that, we'll know that you have something that you want to jump in with. When we call on you, you can unmute and share your question, and we'll go from there. And so we'll go through that cycle a couple of times this evening where we have some questions for our guests, and then we give you some space to jump into the conversation. And then we hope to wrap things up before 10:30.
Excellent. I am so looking forward to this. And I'm so looking forward to this because I'm delighted to be working with you, Valerie, and delighted to be working with Wendy, and delighted that we're resurfacing this again, and really excited about our guest for tonight and about the topic. Because I've been watching the situation in Iran and watching the incredible courage of women really leading in the forefront there. And as an athlete, I've been watching the Iranian climber who has competed without a hijab and now is perhaps suffering really significant consequences for that. And it's making me think about so many women that I encountered when I worked in Latin America, who were often the ones that were leading in terms of creative nonviolent social change. And so it's a topic that I've been fascinated about for a while and curious about and puzzled about and love learning more about. And so I'm glad we're grappling with it tonight. We just want to name at the start the kind of really binary conversation that we're having here in a world in 2022 where we know that there are folks that don't fit into that male-female binary. And so we wanted to sort of acknowledge that, and also acknowledge that there are ways that people who identify and are identified as women have different social spaces for actions, but we don't want to sort of limit that, but just name that. And then we want to tell you a little bit about our guests and why we're really excited to have you here. So we have two people with us tonight. We have Robin Neustaeter and we have McKenzie, both people that are some of my absolute favorite creative thinkers and activists in nonviolence and nonviolent action and feminism. And so let me tell you a little bit about them. Robin has been working in community change, including nonviolent action, in Canada and around the world for 25 years. Most of her work focuses on learning for change. For example, in 2017, she was involved in organizing community support for and awareness of refugee claimants who walked into Manitoba from North Dakota. Robin's work has focused on Indigenous and migrant rights, women, peace and security, and gender-based violence. She's a mom, and she's an assistant professor of adult education and community development at St. Francis Xavier University. So welcome, Robin. Delighted to have you here. And also delighted to have Megan here. So Megan McKenzie, again, over the last 25 years, has been involved in nonviolent action internationally in support of democratic and human rights in Manitoba and around the world, around issues of rights for people with intellectual disabilities, Indigenous rights, and housing for people experiencing homelessness. Her PhD thesis was on the mechanisms of nonviolent action. So welcome with us tonight, Robin, and welcome with us tonight, Megan. And let's get started. Valerie, do you want to ask the first question?
Yeah, I've been looking forward to this conversation. I'm so excited to hear from you and learn from you tonight. And I think that I think this would be true for Karen and Wendy as well, but I am someone who loves stories. And so that's what we want to start with, the way stories shape us and stay with us and inspire us. So I'm going to ask each of you, maybe we'll start with Robin, but if each of you could tell us one of your favorite stories about women engaging in nonviolent action.
Sure, thank you so much. And I'd just like to start by acknowledging that I'm joining you from Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq and Maliseet people. These territories are recognized by the treaties of peace and friendship that the Mi'kmaq and Maliseet first signed with the British Crown in 1725. So I think in the spirit of social change, acknowledging land is very important. And so I was really perplexed by this question for various philosophical, ideological reasons, but also it's just really hard to pick a story. And I think in the spirit of so many women's nonviolent action is very collective. It's hard to pick one women's story, which sounds very individualistic. And so I was thinking more along the lines of, so then maybe it's about what kind of stories that I'm drawn to when I'm listening to or seeking out stories of women who are involved in nonviolent action. And so one of the things that really fascinates me is, change at the social community, very like the grassroots everyday level. And there, when we're looking at social change, it's always, for me, I'm captivated by the stories that have elements of surprise stories of women who are very courageous. And often these women's nonviolent action, kind of slips under the radar. It's never in our faces. It never makes the newsreels. And it's stuff that women do every single day. And it's often in ways that might get dismissed. So for example, just, speaking of the everydayness of the stories that captivate me. So there is an example down in the States where women, and this might be dating myself a bit, but we all remember Tupperware parties and how women, one place in Appalachia, I believe it was, women they came to another woman's house in their community for a Tupperware party, and they started talking about, as we do when we get together, just started talking about everyday lives and like our kids. And they started talking about, oh, well, my kid is sick. And it turns out a lot of children in the community were sick. And then the women were like, oh, so what's going on, right? And, and then that question, right, what's going on, that comes out when women get together at the Tupperware party, turned into this whole campaign, and they discovered that their community was built on a waste site, right? And so, I found it in a book when I was doing my research on women's community change for my doctoral studies. And those kind of stories just keep coming up over and over and over again. Same when I was doing my peace research in the Balkans, women coming together, starting to talk about something that might be dismissed as ordinary or everyday. And then that kind of snowballs into change, right? And not violent change, but non-violent change. And it could be in small things, but, or things that, like I said, might be dismissed by patriarchy as ordinary, yet it makes the lives of the individuals in those communities, the families, the women, it improves their lives and well-being in their communities.
Thanks, Robin. That's a great reminder that even when we feel like we're in positions that don't have power or we're invisible, there are spaces where we can make a difference, and we don't have to just look for those great actions, but the everyday gives us space to do some of this work. Thanks for that story. Megan, the same
Robin,
question.
thank you. Oh, I was just going to say thank you for pointing out that we screwed up at the start and didn't start with the land acknowledgement. And so I'm in the spirit of late is not good enough, but it's better than never. I think we need to say a land acknowledgement for the land that Valerie and I and Daryl are joining from, which is the land that's known as Winnipeg right now, and it's Treaty 1 territory. We also want to acknowledge that it's the traditional and homeland of Anishinaabe and Cree and Dakota peoples and Lakota people, and that it's also the homeland and heartland of the Métis Nation, and that here we drink water from Treaty 3 from Shoal Lake, and we use hydroelectric power from the waters of Treaty 5. So we want to acknowledge that and acknowledge the work that CMU needs to do. And we just exemplified it in continuing to work for a world with more truth and more reconciliation. So thank you, Robin, on many accounts. Megan, what about you? What story are you bringing tonight? Oh, you're muted right now, though. That's the classic line of 2021, 2020.
It is. I had the same problem as Robin in trying to identify one specific example, but there's one type that I really appreciate, and it's often underreported, and it's often also led by grassroots women, and it's resistance to armed groups to undermine them when they're wreaking havoc in their community or in a country. And my favorite type of it is when they find ways to get armed actors to leave or not join into the conflict and take the power away from some of the armed groups by doing that. And I first saw it when I was young in Colombia. There was a bunch of women's groups who'd organized to try to keep their kids and their communities from joining any sides of the conflict there. And most recently, I've seen it with some really wise Indigenous aunties who've been helping folks exit street gangs in Canada. And in between there, I've seen it in Congo in different forms, and in Northern Ireland and in El Salvador and all over the place. And so I just really appreciate it and always try to keep my eyes open for examples of it. And there was an article in 2019, one of the few times it's really been written about this. I mean, it's been written about off and on, but just not a ton. And there was this article in 2019 about these women in Afghanistan. And I just found it so inspiring because these women were from a very rural, remote, conservative area. And this is before the Taliban took over all of Afghanistan in 2021. But the Taliban was causing problems and oppressing folks in their area. And they wanted to try to figure out how to challenge some of that power that the Taliban had. And so they decided to befriend the female members of the Taliban fighters' families. So they befriended the sisters and the wives and the mothers of these Taliban fighters and asked them, will you be our intermediaries with these Taliban fighters? And they were able to communicate with these Taliban fighters and ask really critical questions like, why did you join this? Why did you join to fight with the Taliban? And what would it take for you to leave the Taliban, or why are you staying? And they ended up finding out they were very poor in this area. And these fighters said, well, if we had a better option, if we had small businesses, we would leave. And so these women somehow, despite a lack of resources, got some money together to help finance a bunch of small businesses that these guys had dreamed of doing. And in doing so, they demobilized 11 groups of Taliban fighters in that area. And I just think if they can do that in the middle of such a conservative, remote area, and in demobilizing those 11 groups of Taliban fighters, well, first of all, I just laugh at the thought of this commander of the region, as group after group after group of his fighters defect, and thinking that surely has had some impact on their power and their ability to do what they were doing in the area. But I also think they didn't just demobilize those 11 groups of fighters, they demobilized those families so that the next generation is less likely to join the Taliban, that even extended family members are less likely to join because they now have these small businesses going that can finance the families. And almost even more importantly, they have also shown to the communities that there's alternatives to joining this, and that there's other ways and other things that they can do that to resist it. And so I think that I think it was just genius. And it was just this small bit, and I'm so curious about whatever happened. And I can only imagine that those women are still doing things now. And I just would love to meet them and know what they're up to now. And I just think they're so brave and so clever to have used the connections that they were allowed to have in that environment, and to make use of it to really, undermine that power.
Lovely. Thank you for sharing that vignette. Sorry, Val.
No, I was just going to say that's a fantastic story. I mean, so creative and so effective in reducing that violence for the number of fighters, but also it was a solution that sounds like it made lives better for those families that were involved in Taliban too. So really sort of a win all around, which is fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we think we probably have audience questions, which we'll get to in just a moment. But before we get there, and Megan, maybe we'll start with you and then we'll hop back to Robin in just a sec. But our second question really was, so why do you think women in particular engage in nonviolent action?
Well, I think so many of the women that I have met in different places just did not have the same kind of power immediately granted to them, or the more mainstream types of power available. And so even the most marginalized women were able to, by working together and by being creative and by finding nonviolent actions that they could undertake that were still effective, they were able to capture some power and be able to influence change in their lives, or to make things happen that they wouldn't have been able to have happen otherwise. And also not cause harm to their community in the meantime, because I think women are so often, and especially in conflict zones, end up living with a lot of the care and the consequence and the rebuilding of violence. So I think they are very aware of the multifaceted nature of violence, and also aware that it's like in that Afghanistan situation example there, like it's very much the Hydra. If with violence, if you cut off the one head, just more of the problems appear. And I think that's what causes them to look more holistically at the situation.
Thank you. I've got some thoughts on that, but let's hop to Robin first and hear Robin's addition to that answer.
Thank you. So I was thinking about this question as well, and several thoughts come to mind, so I'm going to share them with you. And kind of building on what Megan was talking about too, it's women using creatively the power that they do have in society. And at the same time, initially when I started thinking about this question, I thought maybe it could be a bit of you could also look at it as a trick question, in the sense, and probably it's intentionally so, or maybe it's me overthinking it. But also there's this strong historical narrative around women and not being violent, right? Around women and maternal care, and really that plays into patriarchal gender roles in our societies, and women as maternal caring beings. And so of course women are going to do nonviolent action based on that master narrative. And so it really kind of got me thinking about the gender norms in society, past and present, maternal behaviors, how those are more attributed to women compared to behaviors that are more violent and physical that are attributed to men. And so even the question kind of, and Karen, you opened that a bit too, right, kind of perpetuates that master narrative. Mm-hmm. And I think, as Megan was talking about it, I think part of the reason is, as we said, like women being using the power in the spaces that they have, because patriarchy, past and present, really does exclude women from so many formal decision making and influencing spaces like tables, rooms, golf games, smokers' corners, the water cooler, all those kind of things. And as I was writing this out in my writing group this morning, and I was thinking about it, and I decided that what we really need to do is stop using the term the metaphorical decision-making table and just really name those spaces so that we can out them and start targeting them, non-violently, of course. Because if we keep just painting them all as a decision-making table, we're not actually naming the spaces where women are excluded, right, so that we can change the reality about women getting into those spaces, or even just disbanding those spaces altogether.
Yes, because as you're talking, I'm thinking about all the other people as you name the spaces. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really an interesting decision. As you name the spaces, it makes it clear all the other groups of people that are also excluded from those spaces.
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry, I interrupted you though. What were you going to go on?
No, So anyway, so that's my call to us. Our call to action is let's name those spaces. And I think a lot of women, are doing nonviolent action, even though they may not even call it that. At least that's my reality when talking with women about peace and peace building and nonviolence. It's like, I'm not doing that. Like, I'm not, when it's like, I didn't live through a war, this isn't a war zone, I'm not doing peace building. And so much of the nonviolence that is happening might not even fall under what so many in the world might, the master narrative around what is nonviolence and nonviolent actions. Mm-hmm. And I think that's why we're so good at it, because we know how to function under the radar, because that's how we are able to survive in patriarchy. Mm-hmm. Just when you think about how Paulo Freire talks about the oppressed learning how to effectively live in an oppressive system. And I think, when I think about women and nonviolent action, I think it, has to do that it's so much of it is collective. And we need to do things collectively so that we have the support of one another, so that women can support each other mentally, physically, support with childcare, transportation, all these kind of very practical things. And it also builds that solidarity that I think is also really important. So, when I think of, participating in marches or organizing or trainings or anything like that, it's the people coming together, building that solidarity and that common vision, and, strategizing and really seeing each other as humans, which in and of itself is also a nonviolent action, I believe. And I think the other thing is, because getting back to that narrative around women and nonviolent action, is that we do have some examples, historical and current, of women doing it. And so those help encourage current and future women, not female and other nonviolent, whoever you are, to be nonviolent activists, to see, like, I see myself. I know there's women in the past who have done amazing things in, Sophie Scholl and many others who have really put their necks out and done things on the line to create change.
Sophie Scholl, in case not everybody knows, was one of the White Rose activists that was part of a movement to disrupt Nazism in Nazi Germany. So she was and she lost her life for that action, she and the other White Rose movement folks. Yeah. Thank you, Robin. Valerie, do you have any follow-up questions, or should we hop to the Zoom call-in part?
Well, one thing that occurred to me, and I'm a little bit hesitant given your comments, Robin, about it being a trick question, but is there anything distinct about the way women work at nonviolent action? Or I think maybe you were hinting at that there's almost an advantage in some ways of being under the radar that gives you space to do something. Are there anything that makes that distinct about the way women do or can go at that work?
Well, I think you kind of touched on it, Val, in the sense that because there's this narrative out there that, women as maternal, that kind of gives women a safe space in which to operate, to do nonviolent action. And in that space, I've seen it being used very creatively to push for change, right? And that's not to say that people who do not identify as women don't also have important and unique and very effective ways of doing nonviolent action. But I realize that we're focusing on people who identify as women doing nonviolent action tonight.
So I love the way you're identifying the way that the oppressor's tools can be used against the oppressor, right? That
Definitely. That's the best way.
Right. if you're going to be sexist, let's use that, right?
Yeah.
Lovely. Thank you. Let's turn to the folks who are in the room with us and see if there's other folks that have questions or comments that they want to chip in with, stories that they want to add. Wait for a moment. Maybe just while we're waiting, I'm going to just name one thing and maybe ask a question. But folks, if you have things you want to add or questions, please put them in the chat or put a hand up so we know that you've got one for us. But Megan, when you were talking, I started thinking about some of the nonviolent action around militarism, and I was thinking about the example of the Russian women in the Chechen conflict that went and got their sons and brought them back, right? Or I was thinking about, and this one I have really mixed feelings about, but I'm going to name it. But one of the tactics going back as far as at least the fictional Lysistrata, but is the sex strike, right? Women refusing to have sex with men until they do X or Y. And there's a great example of Brazilian women who wanted to disarm in the favelas and refused to have sex until the men were involved in a disarmament movement. And I love the creativity of it, but it also feels like such an incredible kind of like gendered thing, as if only the men want sex. And so I just have that sort of mixed feelings about the sex strike. I'd love to hear someone else's thoughts on the sex strike. Robin or Megan, Megan, you're muted again, but we'll.
I'm just thinking a bit, but I think sometimes I'm not always convinced it's the most effective. So I think that's one of the dilemmas that we sometimes run into with nonviolence is we don't think it through very strategically. And is this really the most effective way to put pressure on? Because I think a lot of women would experience violence if they tried to do that type of protest. And I also wonder is that actually, if you don't have that mechanism, right, if you're not actually taking something away from or pushing on the points of power, then it's not going to work. And sometimes too, if you do something that's too controversial, the controversy overshadows the overshadows what you're trying to accomplish. And we've seen that happen in lots of other types of nonviolent actions too, where somebody is so upset about the action that they kind of the message is lost in the controversy of it. And so I think it's critical with those ones to really think through, is this really the best way of going about it? Is this really effective and advantageous for the people that are engaging in it? And is it going to be like, do we remember what they were protesting, or do we just remember the protest?
Thank you. Robin, did you want to chip in on that, or has Megan covered it?
I think Megan has covered it. And just to, I really appreciate, Megan, how you highlighted that it can put women themselves in very precarious situations because sex happens in very intimate spaces. And so just to be mindful of that. And I know there's a lot of examples. It's been used in many contexts, and, you know, it's a very historical tactic as well. And I think, you know, the organizing, but I appreciate what you're saying about just the message and the intention can be undermined or get lost.
Thanks for those comments. We have a comment here from Jody saying, I'd love to hear more stories about women using nonviolence in other parts of the world. I echo that. So I don't know, I can open that up. Megan, Robin, or Karen, do you have more stories for us tonight?
I actually thought of one when Karen and Robin were talking. I had read about this one where there had been some women had been kidnapped by ISIS. And so a group of women, there was checkpoints all around and security all around, but groups of women were allowed to move to go to the to do activities that were allowed by women, but they had to be in a cluster of women. So all these women with full coverings would shuffle off to different parts where they were allowed to go, like certain markets and stuff they were allowed to go to. But what they would do is they would shuffle off near the spaces where these women who had been kidnapped and had been forced to be wives of the ISIS members were as well. But they would just scoop up a couple extra. And they were all dressed in the same covering. And they were doing what good women were supposed to do, getting their food and everything that they were supposed to do to feed their families and everything. And they would go shuffle past again the checkpoint, right past the very men who had kidnapped these women in the first place, not realizing that these gowned women and these covered women were, in fact, some of them were, in fact, their kidnapped brides. Because they wouldn't notice the difference between if 10 women went one way and 12 went the other way, because they're almost invisible to them, right? And there's no way of identifying in them. And I thought that's a great example when you're talking about how women sometimes could take advantage of their roles that they're allowed to do, and undermine the very system that is trying to enforce those roles, and even to the point of, with violence, trying to keep them with these checkpoints and stuff, and just being able to go right straight past them.
Yeah, that's another great story of just subverting something for the opposite way that the oppressor had intended it.
And using the very tools of like saying, oh, you have to be fully covered, and you're only allowed to travel in these large groups of women, and like it's the very tools that they equip them with,
Yeah, that's fantastic. I love it. Karen or Robin, do you have any stories that come to mind along those lines?
Well, earlier Karen mentioned the Committee of Soldiers of Mothers of Russia, and I think that's a really fascinating example as well. And it also, draws on this narrative of the maternal, and they really used that narrative to their advantage to leverage for the changes that they wanted to see first in what was happening in the Russian military and the bullying and things that happened there. And then that grew as, with the Chechen war. And then we saw them now coming out again when Russia invaded Ukraine. And so, this idea that, of mothers literally to the point going to the quote unquote battlefield and taking their sons off the field, right? And so, and using their status as a mother, and so again, using the language of the oppressor to justify what they're doing.
Yeah, really inspiring.
I think the one that I'd add into the mix would be, Gene Sharp has got this classic list of 198 nonviolent actions. And of course, it's limited by the fact that he created the list before we had social media, and there's all sorts of really interesting social media campaigns. But I also feel like it's a really gendered list, and I feel like it misses some really key things. And two that I would say that in my reading come up more often as actions that women do rather than men. One is the use of hospitality. So the offering of food, the offering of care, the offering of as a way to, again, disrupt expectations. And again, I think it's, again, one of those, like using the tools of the oppressor, right? I'm, in the role of the woman handing out the food, and that creates this shift. Not always, but can have that. And so I think those sort of stories fascinate me. And then the other set of stories that fascinate me are stories of, and again, more often women than men doing this, of exchanging oneself for the other, right? But particularly if we're saying, instead of my child, take me, right? And instead of so-and-so, take me. And again, I don't think Sharp really acknowledges that. And I think that's a really powerful, puts the oppressor in a dilemma, right? Because you're being shown up for what you're doing. And also, of course, can be an effective way to either get someone out or maybe even get both out, right? By that confrontation. Those are some of the ones that intrigue me these days.
It's really helpful. Thanks, Karen. I'm not seeing any more comments or raised hands right now, but we'll come back to this again. So if you have questions or comments, there'll be another space for that as we go. So I will maybe jump in with another question now for each of you. Same question again, but we'll give each of you a chance to answer. In terms of nonviolent action, I know people come to it in very different ways and with very different motivations. For some people, it really arises out of their faith, their religious tradition. For some people, they're motivated by the efficacy of nonviolent action, and there's a whole range of other things. So I'm curious, what drew you to nonviolent action initially? What do you find compelling about it? What has made you continue to do it and support it and teach about it for so many years? Robin, why don't we start with you again this time?
Okay, sure. Thanks for asking that question, Val, because it reminded me of some things that I wanted to say earlier in my response, and I didn't get around to that. But so for me personally, growing up Mennonite in southern Manitoba within one of the three traditional historical peace churches, so pacifism was spoken and preached from the pulpit and stuff like this, and so truly coming to a point to understand what does it mean to be a pacifist, and then also recognizing I like activism. So it kind of went hand in hand as a way to live or manifest pacifism. So for me, it's informed by faith and spirituality. That's where it comes from. But then it also, it's a tactic, it's a strategy, it's a value, it's informed by my values. It also, for many people, when I'm thinking about choosing the choice to do nonviolent action, it's affordable. You really don't need much, or you don't even need to go buy anything, to engage, depending on your action, to do nonviolent action. It's accessible. It's and so I think that makes it, on a practical level, can make it very appealing to people. And it's so diverse and creative in what you can do that there's ways to engage many people in different abilities and smarts in nonviolent action, because it is so diverse and calls for much creativity, and you don't need a lot of resources. It's affordable, it's accessible. And so for me, it comes from that faith space, and then it has expanded.
I love the connection to frugality. Affordability. I'll say affordability.
Affordability. It's affordable.
It is. Thank you, Robin. Megan, what about you? What's your answer to that question?
Well, I think you're the answer to that question.
Uh-oh.
won't say how long ago because it will age us both, but when I was about 9 or 10 years old, I was dragged along with my older sister's group that went to see a clown who'd come back from El Salvador to tell some stories about work that she had done down there. And you intrigued me enough to be brave enough to take a night class in downtown Winnipeg 10 years later about conflict resolution. And that intrigue turned into amazement as I encountered more and more examples of it and saw how it was working. And that amazement has continued on as I keep finding more examples and seeing it in places where it's not necessarily labeled as nonviolent action, but it truly is. And I think one of the things that keeps me engaged in it, that gives me hope, even in some of these most devastating situations, the people within have risen up and have found ways to improve their lot despite what's happening around them. So those are the things, and I appreciate lots of what Robin said too about, it's accessible, it's affordable, and people are able to creatively engage in it, even if they don't have a whole bunch of other resources.
And it can be fun.
And it can be fun. And great fun with lots of the stuff we've done.
Yeah.
And
absolutely.
It's so satisfying too when it works. That satisfaction when you see some change happen.
We're going to ask you about that in a moment. We're going to say, tell us a story about a satisfying change that you saw. But I love the way you're leading us to think about mentors. If I think about sort of women who have mentored me, certainly one was my mom. I never ate a green grape until I was about 17 and could eat them outside the house because my mom was an ardent boycotter of green grapes, thanks to the Cesar Chavez farm workers boycott of grapes. Robin, what about you? Who's a mentor in your life? Who's a woman that has inspired you?
So I'd have to say it's also you, Karen, and from when we met.
Okay, I didn't ask that question.
Student at Meadow Simon. Maybe, but there's more, don't worry. But also going back, and this also has a Menno Simons College connection, is that when I was a senior in high school, I came to Menno Simons College for a workshop with Dr. Adam Curl, who had just come back from doing workshops in Croatia, and where he talked about the story of the group of people in Osijek in eastern Slavonia who set up the Center for Human Rights, Nonviolence, and I forget, there's a third part to that. And so Katarina Krohonia, who was part of that group, and that was kind of like, I just have such a vivid memory of that workshop with Dr. Adam Curl and him telling the story about this group and Katarina and what they did in the war. So of course this would have been in 1993, 1994, right? And just flabbergasted at that people could, because all we were hearing at that time was the war in the Balkans and what was happening, in particular Eastern Slavonia is right on the border with Serbia. So they were the worst hit. So cities like Vukovar. And I had the opportunity in 2002 to go to Osijek and through my peace research with the Olaf Palme Center, and actually got to meet Katarina and talk to her in person. And it was just like, oh my God, like, so amazing. And I think that, and then as you start, there's just so many amazing women who defy the odds and, and in big and small ways to create nonviolent change in their lives and their communities.
I love hearing all these stories. And some of the stories you've told, people are being really brave and dangerous and scary contexts. But I love what you said about nonviolent action being accessible. So I'm wondering what kind of advice you would have for, somebody like me sitting comfortably here in North America and intrigued by this, but not having a lot of experience. Where do you suggest somebody would start in getting into this?
I have seen so many wonderful examples of these Indigenous women I've been working with lately, who are wise and hilarious and creative and just real movers and shakers in their community in all different ways. And so I think that that's a wonderful resource for us in Canada and the States, and to be able to look to them. They have lots of deep cultural roots of the women providing wisdom and leadership in their communities. And I've just seen some, especially through COVID, I've just seen them, so many rise up and just do extraordinary things for their communities. So that's one of the places I think I would recommend people go find yourself a bunch of wise aunties and learn from them.
I like that. Community is often a good answer. Another thing we use a lot around here is that word of community, which makes so many things so much easier.
Mm-hmm.
Robin or Karen, do you have an answer to that where to start question?
I'm looking at Robin on the screen.
I'm
Robin's
looking at
back
Karen.
And by the way, folks, if you have questions or comments, now's a good time. I see one in the chat, but please feel free to do that or put a hand up. I think one of the things for me about where to start is years ago, I heard an activist say, find what breaks your heart and then put your heart into it. And for me, that's a really sort of helpful guide, because I can't do everything. And there's just so much. And I sometimes get a bit bogged down by feeling there's so many issues that I should be engaged with, and so many injustices, and I know that I can't do it all. And so finding a way to allow myself to be gentle with the fact that I can't do as much as I wish I could, and then B, to choose what it is I put my heart into. And one of the things is, what is it that really is breaking my heart? And what is it I can't live? Where are the places where I can't live with myself if I'm not doing something? So for me, certainly one of those places is around Indigenous issues in Canada, and another one would be around climate change, right? Those seem to me very pressing issues. And so those are places that I kind of prioritize. I see some interesting questions in the chat. Should we hop to one of these? So Jody asks, what do you find disturbing about women's nonviolent activism? I found the discussion about sex strikes interesting and wondered what other issues you see. Robin or Megan, do you want to speak to that?
Well, there's some that I don't find disturbing, but the people around have found them disturbing. Like there's been lots of nude protests that the people around have found very, very offensive. Was it Nigerian women who did the oil protest?
Well, and Liberian women also.
Liberian as well, yeah. They especially the
older
women.
Doukhobors.
Yeah, Doukhobors in Saskatchewan are big on that. Yeah, and I know there was a good Mennonite man who did a nude protest in the Middle East one time as well, to stop some violence. So I know that I don't find it offensive, but I know that other people have found those ones quite controversial and questionable, but sure brought attention to different situations.
What about you, Robin? What's a disturbing thing that you find about women's nonviolent activism, or is there?
So one of my concerns that comes up in regards to women in nonviolent action is, and we see this with women in war, how our bodies become targets of violence. And so, Karen earlier were talking about how Gene Sharp is very kind of more leaning towards a male experience. But I think too, when I read some of the handbooks that are out there around, nonviolent actions and taking activism and stuff like this, and they rarely talk about risks in a gendered sense, right? And so it's one, like if a woman is going out, on a protest or a march or a standout or a stand-in, or because of the way society is gendered and views our bodies, are at greater risk of gendered violence that is not typically addressed when we go into workshops, for example, or do trainings. And so trying to really emphasize that, or if we're arrested or if we're beaten, how we might be treated by security forces going to be different than it is in men. And those conversations really happen when we're thinking about nonviolent action training, or if I'm reading the handbooks. It's very kind of neutral, but neutral being male.
Another great answer. And there's a question here from Wendy that I'll read out. She says, I'm finding the current discussion by Indigenous feminists of their warrior peace work thought-provoking as a white Mennonite woman. The warrior, according to Pamela Palmater, is one who takes care of the community. What might be more broader warrior energy or conversation do for women working at nonviolent methods towards peace? Again, whichever one of you wants to jump in on that one would be great.
I think sometimes that some of the just I think about some of the Indigenous women I have known that would frame a lot of what they're doing as warrior stuff, but what they're doing is calm strength, it's persistence, it's courage, it's choosing to stand on the right side of history, it's making deep ethical choices and thinking generations ahead. It's standing steadfast in the midst of storms, and no matter what else is happening, it's digging deep into their values and their roots and their culture to inform how they're reaching out. So I think that some of those qualities of warrior can be really useful when looking at nonviolent action, and that they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. It's just that we tend in non-Indigenous society to see warrior as only a violent approach, but it's not necessarily. It's a persistence, it's a courage, it's a wisdom rooted kind of action.
That's a great question. And Megan, I really like your answer because it really gets down to the act of naming and how actions or qualities are named or categorized and labeled, right? And so and one of in my readings on women's community organizing, I came across the term in Jessica Wilkerson's book, To Live Here, We Have to Fight, about women's activism in Appalachia. She uses the term citizen caregiver, which kind of it resonated with me because the way that I have been that I look at with women's nonviolent action is really it's about being present and active in society and trying to create the change. So what might be defined or considered as a citizen, broadly considered, not based on citizenship, and caregiver. And I'm not speaking caregiver in a gendered sense.
I have a great story of a citizen caregiver woman in northern Thailand. So at one point in my life, I was spending quite a bit of time in Thailand working with activists there. And there was a woman whose community had been flooded by dams, hydroelectric dams. And they were supposed to be receiving recompense, and they hadn't received recompense. They'd been forced to move and relocate. And she decided to be the citizen caregiver for her community. She was an older woman, and she felt that this was a role she could take on. And for me, it speaks to that sort of strong warrior piece. So what she did was she went and she had a solo sit-in in the courtyard in front of the seat of government, sort of like the legislative building. And it didn't get enough attention, so she ramped it up, and she brought her water buffalo along. So an elderly woman with a sit-in got some attention, elderly woman having a sit-in with a water buffalo, more attention. And then that wasn't enough attention. So then she tied the water buffalo to a tree, and she did her sitting in the tree in the courtyard. And so this is, escalating over the course of weeks now. So now elderly woman in a tree with a water buffalo in front of the seat of, again, amping it up. And then that wasn't enough. And so she dressed the water buffalo in a suit of men's clothing and put the name of the premier on the side of the buffalo. Right. And that got a lot of attention. In fact, it got so much attention. She went back up in the tree. It got so much attention that the government said, yeah, okay, we'll do it. Oh, no, I'm sorry. They didn't do that first. First of all, what they did was they arrested her, and then they declared her mentally incompetent and put her forcibly into an institution for, quote, the insane, unquote. And one might think that would be the time to wilt or crumble. But instead, of course, what she did was she went on a hunger strike. And so finally, they were forced to release her at that point and say, okay, well, we'll give you the money. And then they didn't. And so she went back with the water buffalo up the tree with a sign on the back of it. And this time they're like, okay, get out of here, just do this. And so that kind of persistence for me is that warrior energy, and also that caregiver, right? Because she wasn't doing it for herself. She was doing it on behalf of that community. And she was saying, this is a role I can take because of my location in our community, because I'm not looking after children. I'm not earning wage. This is a role as a grandmother I can take on. And so for me, it kind of speaks to what you're both saying on that. I can't believe it's 10:26 right now. So, and it isn't actually 10. I should be clear to everybody. It's not 10:26 for everybody. It's 10:26 for those of us in Winnipeg. It is 11:26 for Megan in Quebec. And it is 12:26, as in like after midnight, for Robin, who's been joining us from Antigonish on the East Coast. So we're so grateful for your time here. Val, I think you're going to do a thank you on all of our behalf.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you so much for making time to do this, for talking. I know there's a vulnerability in these unscripted and recorded places, and it's a real gift to hear your stories and your wisdom. And I appreciate you doing it so late at night. Yeah, Megan and Robin, thank you so much. I also want to thank Daryl. I know that Wendy, Karen, and I are all a little bit anxious about managing the technology. So I wanted to say thank you for doing that. Then that was something we didn't have to think about, as we're just enjoying the stories here. So thank you, Daryl. And also thank you to everybody who joined us for this evening. I know it's late for everybody, perhaps not as late as for our guests, but it's still late in the evening. And this really works best when it's a conversation. So thank you very much for joining in.
And Megan or Robin, last word to you. Anything you wanted to say that you didn't get a chance to say before we sign off?
I just wanted to follow up on what Karen was saying about some of the most wonderful, persistent, strong actions I have seen have been by very elderly women who have passed the point of caring what other people think of what they're doing, and have a great deal of wisdom and have a fearlessness that I am enjoying seeing grow in me as I get older and turn into one of those older women that often bring that morality. I've seen them take soldiers down with the words, "You ought to know better. Your mother or your grandmother will be disappointed if they see you on the news talking like that or acting like that." So I think that it's for me, I just hope I grow into these women that I've been mentored by and have watched for so long, with that strong persistence and that deep ethical understanding.
Lovely. Thank you, Megan. What about you, Robin? Any last words from you?
So I just want to thank you for the invitation to participate in this conversation. And it's been wonderful. And also just the opportunity to come together and talk about something so important as nonviolent action and creative challenging power creatively. I think it's always important to talk about that. And it always feels like now is more important than before, but it's important to continue to have these conversations and to highlight and hold up people who are doing this work. So just thank you for starting this back up again and for the opportunity to be part of it.
Lovely. Thank you. And just a reminder to everybody, we will be back on November 16th when Wendy is going to be hosting, and either Val or I will be co-hosting. We don't know what quite that yet. This is an evolving thing. We're really looking forward to the further conversation on Ukraine coming up November 16th at 9:30 in your jammies and your teacup. Thank you, folks.
Good night.
Have a great night.